Allegheny Middle School and Alderdice High School.
Police say 15 shots were fired outside the Destiny of Faith Church. 6 people were wounded. Police say it's not clear if the incident was related to the funeral.
Hard to see those pictures.
This was not supposed to happen. The death of John Hornezes Jr. was sudden and brutal, and it left an entire community struggling to make sense of the loss. News spread quickly, first through a phone call, then through social media posts, and soon through whispers traveling from one street to another. It felt unreal, like a nightmare people hoped they would wake up from. But this was no dream. This was tragedy in its rawest form. Neighbors recalled the exact moment they heard the news. Some froze in disbelief, clutching their phones with trembling hands. Others broke down immediately, unable to contain the flood of emotions that overcame them. Parents held their children a little tighter. Friends who had spoken to John just days earlier now stared in silence, their minds racing with confusion. Everywhere you looked, people were asking the same haunting questions. How could this happen? Who had harmed John? And why? Those questions weren't just whispers of gossip. They were cries of fear, shock, and sorrow. Within hours, the story began to spread beyond the neighborhood. Local news stations reported on it, their headlines cold but heavy. The death of John Hornezes Jr., clips of flashing police lights, caution tape, and somber reporters painted a grim picture for those watching at home. For many, seeing John's name in print or hearing it on television made the loss real in a way that words alone never could. The grief was immediate, but it wasn't simple. There was confusion, denial, even anger mixed with sadness. People asked themselves, why him? Why now? What could have been done to prevent this? Some gathered outside his family's home, offering comfort with candles, flowers, and silent prayers. Others stayed inside, too stunned to face the reality. What struck everyone most was how quickly life had changed. In a single moment, a son, a friend, a neighbor was gone, and the community would never be the same again. The shock wave spread far beyond his family. It touched classmates, co-workers, church members, and strangers who had only heard his name that day. The disbelief lingered like a heavy cloud. It wasn't just about John's death. It was about the sudden reminder of how fragile life can be. And as the hours passed, grief began to shift into something else, a desperate search for answers. People wanted to know not only what had happened, but why. By the time the day of his funeral approached, the questions had only grown louder. The community wasn't just mourning John Hornezes Jr. They were mourning the sense of safety, trust, and normalcy that vanished the moment his life was taken. The funeral would not just be a farewell. It would become a moment of collective heartbreak, a day where emotions spilled over and the need for truth burned brighter than ever. To understand the way of this tragedy, we must first understand who John Hornezes Jr. was. Because John was not just a headline. He was not just another name in a police report or a funeral program. He was a living, breathing person. Someone with dreams, struggles, and a life that was cut far too short. Friends often described him as someone who could light up a room without even trying. He carried a smile that was contagious, a laugh that made even the darkest days feel a little brighter. John had an ease about him, a way of making people feel comfortable in his presence. For many, that's what they remember most. Not the tragedy of his death, but the warmth of his life. He grew up in a close-knit family that valued loyalty, respect, and community. Neighbors remember seeing him outside, playing basketball with friends, helping relatives with chores, or simply sitting on the porch, laughing and telling stories. He was more than just familiar. He was part of the fabric of the neighborhood. But John wasn't perfect, and those who knew him would never claim that he was. Like anyone else, he faced challenges. There were times when life was tough, times when the path ahead wasn't clear. Yet, through it all, he carried himself with resilience. He was determined to push forward, to keep living, and to keep smiling through the pain. For his family, John was more than a son. He was a protector, a helping hand, someone who could be counted on no matter the circumstances. His mother often leaned on him for support, and his siblings looked up to him. For his friends, he was the one who never turned his back, the one who always answered the late-night call when someone needed to talk. People who crossed paths with John would often say he had a rare gift, the ability to connect. Whether you knew him for a day or a decade, he had a way of making you feel like you mattered. That kind of presence cannot be faked. It's something genuine, something that leaves a lasting impact on everyone it touches. And yet, even as he was loved deeply, there were parts of John's story that remained hidden to many. Behind the laughter, behind the kindness, there were struggles that not everyone saw. Like so many young men, he faced pressures from the world around him, pressures that could be overwhelming, pressures that sometimes pulled him into difficult situations. Still, those who loved him never doubted his heart. They believed in the man he was becoming, in the potential he still had ahead of him. He had plans for the future, dreams of building something better, not only for himself, but for the people he cared about. That future, tragically, was taken away before it could ever be realized. As mourners gathered at his funeral, they didn't just see a casket. They saw a lifetime of memories, birthday parties, family dinners, moments of laughter, struggles, victories, and love. They saw the young boy who had grown into a man too soon taken away. And that's why the pain was so deep, because John Hornezes Jr. was not just a victim of tragedy. He was a life full of promise, gone too soon. But even as people celebrated his memory, there were questions that refused to be buried with him. Who wanted to see his life end? And why did his story have to end this way? The answers to those questions would haunt every person who gathered to say goodbye.
The days before the funeral of John Hornezes Jr. were some of the hardest his family and community had ever faced. Grief is heavy enough on its own, but when it comes suddenly, when there's no time to prepare, no chance to say goodbye, it feels unbearable. That was the reality his loved ones were living in the days leading up to his burial. Inside the family home, the atmosphere was thick with sorrow. The sound of quiet sobs carried through the rooms. Photographs of John, once reminders of joyful memories, now became painful echoes of what was lost. Family members clutched framed pictures, whispered prayers, and asked questions that had no answers. Why him? Why now? What could we have done differently? Neighbors described watching people come and go from the house in a steady stream. Some came to cook meals, others to sit silently in awe of their presence. Candles flickered on tabletops. Flowers filled every corner, and handwritten cards lined the counters. The community rallied around the family. But no matter how many people came to the door, the emptiness left by John's absence could not be filled. At night, the streets outside grew quieter than usual. Groups of friends gathered on corners, talking in hushed tones. There were tears, but also long silences, those moments when grief is too deep for words. People lit candles, left flowers at makeshift memorials, and carved his initials into poster boards, writing messages like, "Gone but not forgotten," and "Rest in peace, John." Inside the funeral home, preparations were underway. It's a painful process that no family ever wants to face. Choosing clothes for a loved one to be buried in, selecting the casket, writing the obituary. Each decision felt like another weight pressing down on their hearts. Every choice was permanent. Every step brought them closer to the final goodbye. In those days before the funeral, the reality of John's death began to sink in. For many, denial slowly gave way to heartbreak. It was no longer just a headline or a conversation. It was real. His life was over, and the community was about to face the painful process of letting go. But grief was not the only emotion in the air. Alongside the tears was a growing sense of unease. People weren't only mourning John. They were questioning the circumstances of his death. What really happened to him? Why did his life end so suddenly? And would there ever be justice? Those questions lingered like a shadow over every prayer, every tear, every candle lit in his memory. The family tried to focus on celebrating John's life, but the pain of uncertainty weighed heavily. As the day of the funeral drew closer, the tension grew. People braced themselves for a service that would be more than just a goodbye. It would be a gathering of grief, anger, and unanswered questions. No one could prepare for the emotions that would pour out inside that church. No one could prepare for the silence that would fall as John's casket was carried down the aisle. And no one could prepare for the haunting realization that his story was not yet over.
The morning of the funeral arrived heavy with sorrow. The sky itself seemed to mourn, gray, overcast, and still. The streets leading to the church were lined with cars, their hazard lights blinking in quiet unison, as mourners slowly filed toward the entrance. People walked with their heads low, dressed in black, clutching tissues and flowers. The air was quiet, broken only by the muffled sound of footsteps and the occasional sob from someone who could no longer hold it in. It wasn't just a service. It was a moment when reality would fully set in. Inside the church, the atmosphere was somber. Candles flickered softly along the altar, their small flames dancing against the silence. The casket, polished, dark, and heavy, sat at the front of the sanctuary, draped in flowers. Around it were pictures of John throughout his life. As a child, laughing with friends, celebrating birthdays, smiling at family gatherings. Each photograph told a story. Each photograph reminded everyone of what had been lost. As the doors opened wider, mourners continued to stream in. Some sat quietly, hands folded, heads bowed in prayer. Others wept openly, their tears falling onto the hymn books they clutched tightly. The sound of sniffles filled the air, blending with the quiet murmur of comforting words whispered from one person to another. Then silence, a silence so deep it seemed to press against the walls of the church. All eyes turned as the family entered. They walked slowly, leaning on one another for strength. John's mother clutched a framed photo of her son to her chest, holding it as though letting go would mean losing him all over again. His siblings walked with lowered heads, their grief visible in every step. The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of their pain felt by everyone present. As the service began, a pastor stepped forward, his voice steady but low. He spoke of life, of loss, of the promise of eternal rest. His words were meant to comfort, but for many, they stirred more tears. Each passage of Scripture, each hymn sung by the choir, became a reminder that John's life had ended far too soon. The choir's voices rose softly, singing songs of farewell, their harmonies filling the room with a sense of both beauty and heartbreak. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others stared at the casket, unable to look away, as if waiting for John to somehow rise and walk through the doors again. Throughout the service, loved ones took turns speaking. Some shared memories, stories of laughter, of childhood adventures, of moments that revealed John's kindness. Others struggled to find words at all, their voices breaking under the weight of grief. The microphone passed from hand to trembling hand. Each testimony, another piece of John's story, another reminder just how deeply he was loved. The atmosphere inside the church was more than just sad. It was raw, electric with emotion. Every sigh, every tear, every whispered prayer created a current that flowed through the room. It was as though the entire community was holding its breath together, united in grief but also in a shared sense of disbelief. And as the pastor prepared to close the first part of the service, there was a pause that felt eternal, a hush so complete that even the faint creak of a pew echoed loudly. Everyone knew what was coming next, the hardest part, the moment when they would have to let go. But what happened after would leave the church shaken and the community forever changed? The funeral of John Hornezes Jr. was meant to be a solemn farewell, a sacred moment of mourning. But inside that church, grief did not move in silence. It erupted. It spilled into every corner, overwhelming the walls meant to contain it. The tears came first, soft at the beginning, then louder, heavier. Family members wept openly, their sobs filling the sanctuary until it felt impossible to escape the sound of heartbreak. Some clutched tissues, others buried their faces in their hands. But nothing could silence the sorrow that seemed to echo against the stained glass windows. Then came the cries of anger. Voices rose, sharp and trembling. Why did this happen? One person shouted through tears. Where's the justice? Another cried from the back pews. It wasn't just sadness filling that room. It was rage. Rage that someone so young, so full of life, could be taken away. Rage that questions remained unanswered. Rage that justice felt so far from reach. The pastor tried to restore calm, offering words of peace, but emotions could not be contained. They surged like waves, grief, anger, disbelief, all colliding inside a sanctuary built for prayer, but now echoing with raw, human pain. People leaned on one another for support. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers clenched their fists in frustration. Friends stared blankly at the casket, unable to process the finality of what they were seeing. But amid the tears and cries, one truth became clear. This was not just a funeral. It was a demand for answers, a demand for justice. Whispers turned to conversations, and conversations turned to questions that haunted every heart in the room. Who was responsible for John's death? Why hadn't there been accountability? Why was this life, so full of promise, cut short? These questions were as present in the service as the casket itself. Some mourners expressed their grief through prayer, bowing their heads, whispering words to the heavens. Others could not pray. They sat in silence, their faces heavy with disbelief. And then there were those who channeled their sorrow into calls for truth, reminding everyone present that John's death could not and should not be forgotten. It was a collision of emotions that no one could ignore. The church was not divided in grief. It was united, but in a painful, restless way. Everyone there carried the same weight, the knowledge that this tragedy had left behind more than sadness. It had left behind questions that demanded answers, questions that would not fade away with time. As the service continued, the emotions settled into a quiet tension. The tears still flowed, but the anger simmered beneath the surface. It was clear to everyone in that church. This funeral was not the end of John's story. In many ways, it was only the beginning, because long after the last hymn was sung, long after the final prayer was spoken, the questions remained. And for those left behind, the hardest part was knowing that they might leave the funeral without the answers they so desperately needed. When the church doors finally opened, the weight of grief poured out into the world beyond. The mourners moved slowly, following the casket as it was carried out by solemn hands. Each step down the aisle had been painful, but now came the hardest part, walking with John one last time, toward the place where his body would rest forever. Outside, the air was cool and still. The overcast sky hung low, as if nature itself was mourning with them. A long procession formed. Cars lined up one after another, headlights glowing in silence as they followed the hearse through familiar streets. Those streets had seen John's laughter, his footsteps, his life. Now, they carried him to his final destination. At the cemetery, silence deepened. The casket was lifted carefully, placed gently above the open grave. Family members stood closest, their hands trembling, their faces wet with tears. Some held on to one another for strength. Others could not bear to look at what was about to happen. The pastor spoke again, his voice steady yet heavy with sorrow. He read words of comfort, verses about life after death, about rest and peace. But no scripture could ease the pain of watching a loved one lowered into the earth. Every sentence, every prayer, felt like a reminder of what had been taken too soon. Then came the moment everyone had been dreading. The casket began its descent. The ropes creaked softly, the polish reflecting the gray sky above. As it moved downward, sobs filled the air. A cry broke out from the front row, sharp and piercing, echoing across the cemetery. It was the sound of a heart breaking in real time. Some mourners collapsed to their knees, unable to stand under the weight of grief. Others clutched their faces, hiding tears they could no longer control. The sound of weeping blended with the rustling of leaves, creating a haunting symphony of sorrow. One by one, people stepped forward. Some tossed flowers into the grave, their petals falling softly onto the casket. Others whispered final words, short prayers, private messages meant only for John. Each act was a gesture of love, a desperate attempt to hold on even as they were forced to let go. The family lingered, reluctant to leave. John's mother pressed her hand against the casket one last time, as if she could somehow hold him there with her. His siblings stood silently, tears streaming down their cheeks, their eyes fixed on the earth that would soon cover him. And then, silence. The kind of silence that says everything words cannot. The kind of silence that pierces deeper than any sound ever could. But beneath that silence was something else, a feeling no one could ignore. It was the heavy presence of unfinished business. Questions that refused to be buried with John. How does life really end? Who was responsible? And why had justice not yet been delivered? As mourners slowly walked away, leaving the grave behind, one thing was certain. This goodbye was not the end. It was only the beginning of a story that would continue to echo in the hearts of everyone who knew John Hornezes Jr., because while his body was laid to rest, the truth remained unsettled, waiting to be uncovered. The days after the funeral of John Hornezes Jr. were heavy with silence. For his family, the house felt emptier than ever before. The laughter that once filled the rooms was gone, replaced by quiet tears and unanswered questions. But outside those walls, the community was not silent. Within hours of the burial, neighbors began to gather. At first, it was small, a few candles on a corner, photographs taped to a wall, flowers laid gently against a tree. But as word spread, those small gestures grew into something larger. Vigils were organized. Crowds came together at dusk, their faces illuminated by candlelight, their voices united in prayer and song. People who had never met John stood alongside those who knew him best. They came not just to grieve, but to show solidarity, to say, "We will not forget." Handwritten signs appeared with messages like "Justice for John" and "Gone too soon." Every flickering candle was more than just a symbol. It was a promise that his memory would not be buried in silence. But it wasn't only grief that filled the streets. It was also determination. Determination to demand answers. Determination to make sure no one else has suffered the same fate. Determination to hold accountable those responsible for taking John's life. Community leaders spoke out, calling for transparency. Friends and family gave interviews, their voices breaking but their message clear. John mattered. His life mattered. And his story will not be forgotten. On social media, his name trended. Posts poured in from across the city and beyond. People shared photos, memories, and calls for justice. The digital world became an extension of the candlelit vigils, spreading John's story far beyond the neighborhood he once called home. But amid the unity, the same haunting questions echoed. Why did this happen? Who was responsible? And will there ever be justice for John Hornezes Jr.? The legacy of his funeral was more than sorrow. It was a spark that lit a fire in the hearts of those who knew him, and even in the hearts of strangers. Because John's death was not just a tragedy for one family. It was a wound felt by an entire community. And so, his story continues, not just in the memories of those who love him, but in the voices of those who refuse to let his name be forgotten. As we reflect on the funeral of John Hornezes Jr., one truth becomes clear. This was not just a goodbye. It was a call to action, a call to remember, a call to speak out, a call to demand justice. Because every life lost too soon deserves answers. Every story deserves to be told. And John's story, his life, his legacy, must continue to live on. So I ask you, the viewer, what do you believe really happened to John Hornezes Jr.? Was justice ever truly served? Or is the truth still waiting to be uncovered? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and let your voice be heard. Because silence is not an option. Together, we keep John's memory alive. Together, we search for the truth. This is not the end of the story. This is only the beginning.